The automatic doors of St. Jude's Medical Center hissed open as Ryu Haesol strode inside, his sharp black suit a jagged shadow against the sterile, blue-toned walls. The sharp, clinical scent of antiseptic and ozone wrapped around him like a cold shroud, a sensation that bit at his skin. He was here for one dark objective: to ensure a rival enemy did not survive the night in the high-security surgical wing. His dark eyes swept the silent, gleaming corridor, taking in the humming monitors and the soft, rhythmic beeping of life support systems. This place felt like stepping into an alternate reality, a world of light and silence far removed from the steel and shadows of his usual domain. As the head of a powerful Korean syndicate, Haesol commanded respect through power and fear, but here, surrounded by the heavy silence of the surgical floor and the faint chemical hum of survival, he felt oddly displaced. "He's still in recovery, you can't go in," a guarded, intense voice called from the nurse's station. Haesol's breath caught. That voice, firm, melodic, yet sharp as a scalpel, was one he had never forgotten, despite the 6 years he'd spent trying to bury it. His heart hammered against his ribs, not from fear, but from a sudden, paralyzing shock as a figure emerged from the prep room, a white laboratory coat draped over surgical scrubs. Dr. Calder Rowe froze mid-step, a small boy perched on her hip, his innocent gaze fixed on the man in the dark suit. The child looked up at Haesol with wide, curious eyes, completely oblivious to the seismic shift that had just occurred in the universe. "Haesol," Calder whispered, her voice barely audible above the low hum of the hospital. Time seemed suspended in the cold, clinical air of the surgical wing. Haesol stood frozen, his carefully constructed world tilting on its axis as he stared at the woman who had once been his everything. Calder looked exactly as he remembered, her expression guarded with a professional authority that saw straight through his defenses. But now she held a child, a beautiful little boy who couldn't be more than 5 years old. "Mama, who's the man with the drawings on his neck?" Soren Cade asked, his innocent curiosity that only children possessed. The silence of the VIP wing was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical sigh of ventilators that served as a grim reminder of why Haesol was here. He adjusted the cuff of his charcoal black suit, the fabric feeling like armor against the sterile, unforgiving blue of the hospital walls. Every step he took down the polished corridor was an exercise in lethal intent. He wasn't here to negotiate or offer mercy. He was here to finish what had started in the rain-slicked alleys of Seoul 3 nights ago. His rival, the man who had dared to siphon from the PHANUEL organization's coffers, lay behind one of these heavy, soundproof doors, vulnerable and broken. Haesol's eyes remained cold, mirroring the steel and shadows of the world he commanded. To anyone else, this was a place of healing, but to him it was merely a strategic bottleneck where an enemy could be permanently erased without the mess of a street-side execution. He felt the weight of the burner phone in his pocket, waiting for the signal that the security cameras had been looped. His thumb brushed over the ink on his neck, the tattoo a permanent badge of a life that demanded total loyalty and offered no exits. The air in the hallway was thin and tasted of chemicals, a sharp contrast to the smoke-filled rooms where he usually dictated the fate of men. He felt oddly displaced as he passed a row of plastic chairs, his presence a violent intrusion into a sanctuary of recovery. He didn't care for the morality of it. In his world, a rival was a cancer, and Haesol was the cure. As he neared room 402, his hand reached into his jacket, his fingers finding the cold, familiar grip of his resolve. He wasn't just a man in a suit, he was the head of an organization that thrived on the power and fear he radiated. He stopped before the heavy door, his shadow stretching long and dark across the floor. He could almost hear the frantic beating of his rival's heart through the glass, a frantic drum before the final silence. He had spent years learning how to silence voices that stood in his way, moving away from the old ways, only to find that sometimes the old ways were the only ones that worked. He took a slow, measured breath, ready to push through the door and execute the dark errand that had brought him into the light. But as his hand touched the handle, the world tilted on its axis, and the clinical piece he intended to shatter was replaced by a presence he hadn't prepared for. Hazel's hand tightened on the cold metal of the door handle, but he did not push it open. His gaze drifted to the reinforced surgical glass of the adjacent operating theater, and the world of vengeance he had carried inside him suddenly went quiet. Through the window, under the harsh, uncompromising glare of the surgical lamps, he saw her. Time did not just slow, it seemed suspended in the sterile, blue-toned air of the corridor. The woman stood with a posture of absolute moral authority, her eyes focused with a precision that made his own lethal intent feel clumsy and small. It was Calder. She was dressed in blue medical scrubs, a white laboratory coat layered over them like a shroud of light. 6 years of steel and shadows vanished in an instant, replaced by the memory of a brilliant woman who had once challenged every dark truth he thought he knew about life. She was his everything, the girl who had almost made him believe he could choose hope over obligation. Now she was a master of a different domain, her dark skin radiant even under the clinical lights, her hair styled in the elegant twists he used to trace with his fingers in the quiet hours before his father's world reclaimed him. As he watched her work, Hazel's heart hammered against his ribs with a violence no rival had ever provoked. He saw the way her hands moved, not to take life, but to painstakingly stitch it back together. The dark errand that had brought him here felt like ash in his mouth. He was a man who commanded respect through power and fear, yet staring at the divine face of the woman he had abandoned, he felt entirely powerless. The glass between them was more than a physical barrier. It was a transparent wall separating the man he had become from the life he had thrown away. He stood paralyzed, his carefully constructed world tilting on its axis as the ruthless boss of the PHANUEL organization began to crumble from within. Hazel remained frozen before the glass, the weight of his dark errand dissolving into a heavy, suffocating guilt. The clinical silence of the hallway was suddenly broken by the soft, rhythmic squeak of sneakers against the polished tile. A small boy, no older than 5, wandered into the blue-toned light of the corridor, his presence a divine interruption to the violence Hazel had intended to unleash. The child stopped just a few feet away, clutching a small plastic toy with a grip that reminded Hazel of a treasure held tight against a storm. He looked up at Hazel with curious brown eyes that seemed to hold a purity the Mafia Boss hadn't encountered in years. There was no fear in the boy's gaze, only an innocent curiosity that stripped away Hazel's carefully constructed armor. The boy's hair was dark and styled in a way that felt achingly familiar, and his gaze was steady, the serious expression of someone much older than his years. "Are you waiting for the magic too?" the boy asked, his voice carrying the soft, melodic lilt of his mother. Hazel found his voice, though it came out rougher than intended, a jagged sound in the quiet hallway. "What magic?" "Mama says this place is for magic," the boy said, gesturing toward the operating theater where Calder was still working. "She says you mix hope with medicine and happiness comes out." He took a step closer, his small sneakers squeaking again, and looked at the intricate, dark ink tracing up Hazel's neck. "I like your drawings. They look like the dragons in my stories." The boy's words hit Hazel like a physical blow, his carefully constructed world tilting on its axis. The tattoo, a symbol of steel and shadows and a life of power and fear, was being viewed through the lens of childhood wonder. Hazel felt a seismic shift in his chest, an unexpected tightening that made it difficult to breathe. "I'm Soren," the boy announced, offering a small, trusting smile that was pure sunshine. Haesal looked from the boy to the woman behind the glass, the realization of who Soren was crashing over him like a tidal wave. This was his son, the treasure he had lost to the shadows. As Soren reached out a small, sticky hand to touch the fabric of Haesal's suit, the Mafia boss felt his defenses shatter completely. He was no longer a man of power and fear. He was a father standing in the wreckage of his own choices, pierced by the gaze of a child who didn't yet know how much he was owed. Haesal stood paralyzed as Soren's small hand remained anchored to his sleeve, the boy's innocent curiosity acting as a tether to a reality he wasn't prepared to face. He looked past the child's dark, tousled hair and back through the surgical glass, where Calder's brow was furrowed in intense concentration. The machines in the room began to chime with a frantic, rhythmic urgency, and he watched as Calder's hands moved with a professional authority that was both beautiful and terrifying. It was then that the true weight of his dark errand crashed down upon him, causing a seismic shift that made the floor feel as though it were liquefying beneath his expensive shoes. The man on the table, the rival Haesal had come to finish, was not just an enemy to be erased. He was the patient Calder was currently pouring her entire soul into saving. In an instant, Haesal's world of steel and shadows collided with the magic and healing of the woman he had never stopped loving. If he followed through with his intent, he wouldn't just be securing his organization's dominance, he would be undoing Calder's work and destroying the very life she was fighting to preserve. He looked down at Soren, who was watching him with curious brown eyes, waiting for an answer about the magic. The realization hit Haesal like a physical blow. His hands were built for power and fear, while hers were built for restoration. The internal collapse was absolute. His heart, long hardened by the politics of the PHANUEL organization, hammered against his ribs with a new, agonizing kind of vulnerability and paralyzed shock. He was no longer just at odds with a rival family, he was at odds with his own heart. The man he had intended to silence was the only person standing in that room between Soren and a future defined by the same loss Haesal had suffered. As the red surgery in progress light flickered, Haesal felt his resolve turn to ash, the cold grip of vengeance replaced by the suffocating realization that to be a fancy man in Soren's eyes, he would have to let his enemy live. The heavy double doors of the operating theater finally swung open with a pneumatic hiss, and the red light above them died. Calder emerged, her white laboratory coat stained with the sweat of a 6-hour battle for a life Haesal had intended to discard. She stopped when she saw him, her posture immediately hardening into a shield of professional and moral authority as she shifted Soren higher on her hip. Haesal stood paralyzed, the power and fear he usually commanded, replaced by a vulnerability and paralyzed shock that left his throat tight and his hands empty. "He's stable," Calder said, her voice sharp and clinical, cutting through the heavy silence of the blue-toned hallway. She didn't ask why he was there. She saw the dark errand in the set of his jaw and the tailored armor of his black suit. "But don't think for a second that your business matters here, Haesal. In this wing, I am the only law that exists." Haesal took a step forward, his eyes fixed on Soren, who had fallen into a light, trusting sleep against her shoulder. "Calder, I didn't know," he whispered, his voice rough with an emotion he hadn't felt in 6 years. "You didn't know because you didn't want to know," she countered, her eyes blazing with the fire of half a decade of being pregnant and alone and terrified. She stepped closer, the scent of antiseptic on her scrubs clashing with the steel and shadows he radiated. "I spent years watching the door, thinking you might choose love over duty, but you chose the PHANUEL organization instead. You chose the shadows, so I chose to give Soren the light." The accusation hung between them like a blade. Hazel looked at his son, his own blood, and realized that while he had been moving away from the old ways to legitimize his power, Calder had been building a future full of possibilities without him. She had raised a boy who saw magic in healing, while Hazel had only ever seen suitable strategic mergers. "He thinks you're a fancy man from a storybook," she said, her voice breaking with a sudden, jagged pain. "But I know the man who disappeared without a word. I won't let you disrupt his life with the violence you carry in your pockets." As she prepared to walk away, Hazel felt his world tilt further on its axis, the weight of her moral authority crushing the ruthless boss he used to be. Hazel stood in the echoing silence of the blue-toned hallway, his gaze fixed on the double doors where Calder had vanished. The steel and shadows of his world felt like a suffocating weight, a stark contrast to the sterile clarity of this sanctuary. He looked down at his own hands that had signed territorial agreements and commanded respect through power and fear, and felt a sudden, visceral wave of loathing. For years, he had believed that his position as the head of the PHANUEL organization made him untouchable, but in the presence of Calder's healing hands, he felt oddly displaced and fundamentally hollow. He walked toward the surgical glass again, staring at the empty operating table where Calder had just performed a miracle. The machines were being wiped down, and the floor was being scrubbed clean of the struggle for life. Every movement by the hospital staff was a testament to restoration, while his own legacy was built on what he had been forced to disappear or destroy. He remembered her voice describing baking as magic, mixing love to create happiness, and realized she had brought that same magic to the hospital, using medicine and hope to mend what men like him broke. The power he had sacrificed his everything for now felt like ash in his mouth. He had spent 6 years trying to legitimize everything, yet he was still a man who barged into a place of life with the intent to finish an enemy. He realized that Calder's moral authority didn't come from fear or titles, but from a life lived in the light, dedicated to the innocent curiosity of a son he had never known. A heavy blanket of unspoken regret pressed down on him. He thought of the suitable life he had planned, the strategic merger and the suitable bride, and it felt like a hollow mockery of the family he had walked away from. His chest tightened unexpectedly as he envisioned Soren's pure, sun-shining laughter being snuffed out by the very shadows Hazel commanded. He was no longer the fearless leader. He was a man standing in a cold, clinical atmosphere, finally realizing that the sweetest things in life couldn't be bought or negotiated. He didn't want the crown. He wanted the magic he had lost. The clinical blue light of the hallway flickered as a shadow detached itself from the far end of the corridor. Heisel's instincts, honed by years in the steel and shadows, screamed before his eyes even registered the threat. It wasn't his own men, it was a rival hit squad, sent to finish the job he had hesitated to complete. They moved with a jagged, violent energy that had no place in this sanctuary of magic and healing. Heisel stood at the crossroads of his own carefully constructed world, the weight of his burner phone and the weapon in his jacket suddenly feeling like lead. He looked at the double doors where Calder and Soren had disappeared, then back at the room where his enemy lay vulnerable. In the old world, he would have stepped aside, letting the rivals do his dark errand for him. It would have been the suitable choice, the one that preserved his reputation and his power. But then he remembered Soren's innocent curiosity and Calder's healing hands, and a seismic shift occurred in his chest. If he let these men pass, the divine interruption he had just experienced would be drowned in blood. The hitmen drew closer, their presence a stark contrast against the pastel quiet of the recovery wing. Heisel stepped into the center of the hallway, his tailored black suit widening to block the path. He didn't move to attack, he moved to shield. For the first time in his life, he was using his power and fear not to destroy a life, but to protect the future full of possibilities that Calder was fighting for. Not here. Heisel said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that carried the authority of a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. He wasn't protecting a rival, he was protecting the peace of his son and the sanctity of the woman who haunted his dreams. As the first hitman lunged, Heisel met the violence with a controlled, defensive fury. He was no longer a mafia boss securing a merger. He was a father standing at the gate of a fairy tale, choosing the right choice over the easy choice. In that moment of vulnerability and paralyzed shock, he realized that true mercy wasn't a sign of weakness, but the ultimate expression of the power he had finally learned to value. The adrenaline of the corridor fight faded, leaving Heisel with a trembling in his hands that no amount of cold discipline could steady. He retreated from the sterile blue of the surgical wing and found himself standing before the heavy, arched doors of the hospital chapel. Inside, the cold, clinical atmosphere of the hospital was replaced by a dim, amber glow and the faint scent of wax, a sensation that wrapped around him like a warm embrace he hadn't felt in years. The silence here was different. It wasn't the deafening silence of a graveyard, but a heavy, expectant quiet. Heisel moved toward the front, his tailored black suit feeling like a heavy skin he was finally ready to shed. He thought of the dark errand that had brought him here, and how close he had come to destroying the magic and healing Calder had built for their son. The realization that his power had almost cost him the only treasure that mattered hit him like a physical blow, and for the first time in his adult life, the head of the PHANUEL organization felt his carefully constructed world cracking open. His knees hit the carpeted floor with a dull thud. Kneeling in the shadows of the empty pews, he felt oddly displaced, yet more present than he had been in 6 years. He closed his eyes, seeing the innocent curiosity in Soren's gaze and the moral authority in Calder's eyes. The easy choice was to walk back to the steel and shadows, to marry a suitable bride, and continue a life of power and fear. But as he whispered a desperate, fractured plea into the silence, he knew he was choosing the right choice instead. He was choosing to mix love with flour and sugar, metaphorically and literally, to leave behind the violence for the sake of the boy who called him Fancy Man. Tears he had suppressed since his father's death glistened in his eyes as he surrendered his shadows to the light. In that sacred, quiet space, Heisel wasn't a boss or a criminal. He was a man begging for a second chance to be worth the risk. He stayed there until the seismic shift in his heart felt permanent, a promise made in the dark that he intended to keep in the light. The transition from the steel and shadows of the PHANUEL organization to the sterile, bright reality of the hospital did not happen with a single act, but through a calculated, relentless dismantling of Ryu Heisel's former life. He stood in his high-rise office for the last time, the city lights below looking like a map of the territory he no longer wished to conquer. The burner phones were silent, and the ledgers that once detailed territorial disputes were replaced by legal documents for a charitable foundation. He was legitimizing everything, moving away from the old ways that had kept him prisoner for 6 years. The process was a seismic shift that required the same power and fear he had once used to dominate, but redirected toward restoration. He turned over control of the syndicate's street-level operations to Shung Jun, ensuring those who stayed were moved into legitimate security and logistics firms. The vast, illicit resources of the organization were poured into a trust designed for one purpose, funding the hospital's charity ward, where Dr. Calder Rowe performed her miracles. He wanted to ensure that every little boy who walked those blue-toned hallways had a future full of possibilities, regardless of their family's name. As he signed the final papers, Heisel felt a tightness in his chest that wasn't regret, but a profound sense of relief. He was shed of the tailored armor that had hidden his vulnerability for too long. His restoration of identity was nearly complete. He was no longer a ghost of the PHANUEL legacy, but a man rebuilding himself from the flower-dusted ruins of his past mistakes. He spent his afternoons in a quiet office at the foundation, trading his dangerous whispers for conversations about pediatric grants and surgical equipment. He knew he still had a lot to prove to Calder, and a lot of trust to rebuild. But as he looked at a photo of Soren on his desk, he felt lighter than he had in years. He was finally using his hands for something that wouldn't leave them stained, proving that some things can be fixed when a man chooses happiness over obligation. He had come to the hospital to finish an enemy, but in the end, he had finished the version of himself that was the true obstacle to his home. 9 months later, the morning sun streamed through the wide glass windows of the hospital's new pediatric wing, casting golden light across the fairy tale playroom Hassel had helped design. The sterile, blue-toned chill of the corridors was gone, replaced by a warmth that felt like a warm embrace. Ryu Hassel stood in the center of the room, his tailored black suit replaced by a simple linen shirt, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the ink on his arms as he sat at a low table. He was no longer a boss of power and fear, but a student under the watchful, serious supervision of a 6-year-old teacher. No, Appa, Soren said with the patience of someone far beyond his years, using the Korean word for father that had become as natural as breathing. The dragon's scales have to be green, like the magic ones, he demonstrated with a crown, his small hands moving with a confidence that humbled Hassel every single day. You're absolutely right, Hassel said solemnly, leaning down to Soren's eye level. I clearly need more practice. That's okay, Soren chirped, leaning against Hassel's shoulder with a trusting weight that still made Hassel's chest ache with longing and gratitude. Mama says practice makes perfect. Calder appeared in the doorway, her white doctor's coat open to reveal a relaxed smile that possessed a lightness it hadn't 6 months ago. She watched the interaction with expressive brown eyes that no longer saw through his defenses, but welcomed them. The simple gold band on her finger caught the light, a promise of the second chance they were building together. Is the Dragon City almost finished? She asked, her voice like warm honey as she stepped closer. Almost, Hassel replied, catching her hand gently as she passed. The transition away from his old life had been a seismic shift of planning and sacrifice, but looking at his family, he knew he had no regrets. He had traded his dangerous whispers for bedtime stories and farmers market trips. Soren reached for a snack from a shared bowl, handing a piece to Hassel first. Here, Appa. Mama says sharing makes everything taste better. As Hassel took a bite, he realized that the sweetest things in life couldn't be bought or negotiated. He had come to this hospital to finish an enemy, but he had found his forever instead. He was no longer a man of steel and shadows, but a man truly home at last, surrounded by the magic of a life earned through love and patience.